start the lecture tonight, I would like to make a few announcements. The first one is that tonight's lecture will be the last of 97. We shall stop temporarily for the holy month of Ramadan, and inshallah we will start 98 as scheduled. The second is we have a limited number of publications of the Dar on display in the hall as you come in. These are put on a very special holiday price or sale, so if you haven't seen them yet, take a look after the lecture. The third is that we have a conference tomorrow at 7 o'clock here in this hall. It will be in Arabic, so you're more than welcome to attend. So far, this season's lecture series, a wide spectrum of subject matter has been covered. American museums, Saudi Arabian archaeology, historic maps of Kuwait, the Crusades, Kuwait boat building, Arabic scenes, the garden and Islamic architecture, and a new acquisition of the Dar have been discussed. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Nasser Rabbat, is an architect and a historian. Although he teaches at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he has just finished a year at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, in New Jersey. His lecture tonight is based on the research he did in Princeton, and we are fortunate to be able to share some of his most recent findings and on the shaping of the Mamluk image. Dr. Rabbat.
Thank you. I just have to adjust all this modern technology. I have a few wires to put on and a few things to arrange. I would like to start by just expressing my thanks to Sheikh Hassan Sabah for this opportunity. This is my first time in Kuwait, indeed my first time anywhere south of Syria where I'm from. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to come see the place, know the people. And I'm thankful also for the opportunity to come and speak here to you on a subject that is actually extracted from a book that I'm writing. And for the time being, the title is going to be The Shaping of the Mamluk Image. So I've used the title that I'm thinking of as the title for today's talk. I'm going to ask your indulgence. I'm going to turn the lights on and off a few times. This is a technique that I've learned teaching for now 8 years, history of art and architecture. People tend to sleep if it's dark for so long. So I'm going to make sure that none of you will speak. Okay, let me start now. The establishment of Mamluk rule in Egypt and Syria in the second half of the 13th century was a unique phenomenon in the medieval world. The new regime, which continued to follow patterns of organization developed under the Seljuks, Zengids, Ayyubids, or even Fatimids of Egypt, was nonetheless, in a more fundamental and conceptual sense, revolutionary. This was not merely because the Mamluks themselves assumed the rule without a mediator, a model that had existed in Egypt and had deep roots in Egypt and elsewhere in the Islamic land, especially in the near contemporary Sultanate of Delhi, but because this was the first time and arguably the only time where a consciously perceived and carefully formulated Mamluk system became the structural backbone of a new and long-lived polity and a new ruling elite with its own views, tastes, and distinct codes of behavior. This new socio-political system owed much of its strength to the genius, far-sightedness, perseverance, and good luck of two outstanding rulers, al-Zahir Baybars and al-Mansur Qalawun, who between the two of them ruled approximately between 1260 and 1290. So almost 30 years with the interruption of 2 years of 2 sons of al-Zahir Baybars. And to a lesser degree, Qalawun's 2 sons, al-Ashraf Khalil and al-Nasser Muhammad, and evidently their allies among the Mamluks. During their reigns, they were able to distill and implement from varied sources a hierarchical political structure and a high military culture. This process was experimental at the beginning. It was partly appropriated from the established Islamic koine of the land, partly adopted from admired examples such as the Mongol system, and partly forged from the bits and pieces of customs and traditions the Mamluk brought with them from their countries of origin, that is the Asiatic steppes, the lands of the Kipchaks, and later the Caucasus, and the experiences they underwent in their new abode. The new system was meant to create a sense of solidarity between the disparate groups of Mamluks, all foreign and forcibly imported to Egypt and Syria, while at the same time clearly and consciously distinguishing them from and elevating them above the local population. These same shrewd Mamluks, however, were also heroic warriors. Through their rigorous military and religious training, they had been imbued with a heightened sense of a mission of liberation and conquest. Once in power, they managed to channel the military, material, and spiritual resources available to them to sustain a counter-offensive against the Crusaders and to reconquer all the castles and cities they had held on the Syrian and Palestinian coasts, with the last one, Acre, that is Akka, falling in 1292 to al-Ashraf Khalil. They simultaneously repelled many Mongol forays into Syria and led campaigns against a host of unruly neighbors, such as the Armenians of Sis. Is my voice reverberating, or is this what I'm hearing? Huh? So there's an additional dimension. Domestically, they cunningly purged all assertions of autonomy among dissatisfied princes and freebooting Arab and Turkoman tribes in Syria, Transjordan, and Upper Egypt. But though they functioned within the confines of an exclusionary ruling system that depended heavily on military power, the Mamluks understood the importance of legitimacy and popularity in their Islamic context. To this end, they allied themselves with, employed, and patronized the religious and literary class, who sometimes served them as propagandists and apologists. They also took their civic and social duties, as they understood them, seriously. They commissioned all kinds of artifacts and endowed citadels and city walls to defend their reign, and civic structures to support social and religious activities and improve their piety. Mosques and madrasas to educate a new class of jurists, zawiyas and khankas to lodge militant ascetics and Sufis, bimaristans and sabil kuttabs to serve the urban populace, and mausolea to commemorate their lives and aggrandize their deeds. They also used the structures they built to communicate messages of political and propagandist nature in a much more efficient way than their contemporaries did. They used an epigraphic system to actively publicize their enactment of religious regulations regarding social organization and stressed their religiously and militarily glorifying actions and qualifications. Can we have the lights off, please? And the first slide. This epigraphic system, consisting of carefully calibrated royal titles, sometimes prefaced or interspersed with thoughtfully selected Quranic verses, was directed at the general population. The inscriptions, and here I'm showing you 2 examples. This is an inscription by al-Zahir Baybars on the citadel of Damascus, on the eastern wall of the citadel of Damascus. And you can see here the lions of al-Zahir Baybars, which are effaced. And this is a detail of the inscription on which we have some of his titles. The one that you see here is al-Mujahid al-Murabit, and I can't read the last one here. And then al-Faqir ila Allah ta'ala, this is probably before the name of the prince who built it. And can we have the next, please? And this is the other example that I'm showing from the southern wall or the southern tower in the citadel itself, where in the Machikolis, in one of the Machikolis in the middle, Mansur Qalawun built also this tower and put his name here. You can see it, Al-Mansur, Al-Malik Al-Mansur, Sayfuddin al-Dunya Qalawun al-Salihi. And down here, which I don't have a detail of it, is another inscription by Al-Zahir Baybars, which actually has a very strange shape, a pear-shaped or a grenade-shaped inscription. That's it. Can we have the lights on, please? The inscriptions were placed in highly visible locations, primarily on the external walls of both conquered and built citadels and towers, mosques and other religious edifices, and palaces. That these inscriptions were meaningful and their messages intentional is evident to any casual modern observer from their profuse recurrence in different media, sizes, and colors on every building they endowed and every object they commissioned. Not all visual indices of the early Mamluk period, however, have clear genealogy and function, or are so readily interpretable as the royal inscriptions. In fact, a number of architectural and artistic innovations or revivals which appeared in the works sponsored by these same early Mamluk sultans seem to us bizarre, ephemeral, foreign, ambiguous, or totally incomprehensible. They include figural or architectural representations depicting horsemen, processions, hunts, and images of sultans and emirs, or of palaces, castles, and cities with trees and rivers. They include also objects and manuscripts decorated with an unusual mix of inscriptions, stylized images of real and mythical creatures, and little understood emblems that are called ranks, which may have suggested the magically induced attributes of their holders or codified their position in the Mamluk hierarchy. My argument is that these visual signs can only be understood as experiments, some successful and therefore lasting, and some not, in the construction of a Mamluk image. Like their organizational, political, judicial, ceremonial, and cultural counterparts, these artistic experiments had different histories and trajectories. They were invented, assembled, or borrowed from various imported or revived modes and techniques. And like their counterparts, they tried to reconcile different and often contradictory cultural and artistic traditions in the attempt to fashion a new, workable, and durable Mamluk image. I'm also arguing that, like other cultural expressions sponsored by the same sultans, religious and historical treatises and propagandist sermons, texts, and poetry, these visual signs reflect their ideological and cultural stance and reveal their political and military ambitions. They, perhaps even more than texts and sermon, truly embody their tastes, views, and mentalité, since images and forms usually animate basic feelings and fundamental cultural attitudes, and since their meanings are readily understood by all people, educated or not. It follows that I'm also suggesting that the early Mamluk sultans were more than just passive patrons, simply interested in fulfilling functional, propagandist, or social requirements through the buildings and artifacts they commissioned. They were directly and probably actively involved in choosing, articulating, and manipulating the various images projected through their artifacts and buildings, as much as they were the builders of the new Mamluk polity. Furthermore, they seem to have perceived and appreciated the different communicative potentials of various artistic and decorative elements and used them judiciously in their appropriate venues where they would have the maximum desired effect on their designated audience. I admit, however, that I have no explicit reference to back any of my claims. Nor do I think any such mention would ever be found in the historical sources of the period, which seem to have been, with some remarkable exceptions, such as the work of Ibn Shaddad, the work of Maqrizi, and the work of Abu Hamid al-Qudsi, the other works seem to be unresponsive to, or at least little moved by artistic and architectural activities, their meanings and their marks on their environments, as opposed to the enthusiasm and the enthusiastic discussions in these same sources of literary works, be it poetry or prose, or of legal and liturgical issues. The reasons behind this frustrating indifference, which I treat in full elsewhere, that is in the book, that is in the work now, are complex. It, however, that is the reason, could not have been either objective or collective. That is, the sources could not have been impartially recording the situation as it was, a claim that they themselves never make, yet we, that is the modern, always expect it of them. Nor could they have been representative of common attitudes toward art and architecture in a Mamluk society at large, which experienced a formidable outburst of artistic activities and artistic production in the formative period in the late 13th century. In fact, the few references in the same sources to the practices and views about art and architecture among the Mamluk elite and the common people underscore a variance in perception and in taste between these two social groups and the literati, authors of the texts. That is, two groups that seem to be much more interested in art and in representation than actually the authors themselves of the text that tell us about these two groups. My analysis, therefore, will have to depend on the artifacts themselves to compensate for the limitations and biases of the written sources. My method is simple. I will identify a number of the artistic experiments I'm talking about and treat them as interpretable historical documents where expressions of the Mamluk image are articulated and preserved for us to decipher. Examples are abundant and diverse, though the surviving ones constitute only a small fraction of what was made under the Mamluks. Here I will examine three artistic experiments. The first is that of figural representation of Mamluk sultans and emirs in various media and environments. The second is the representation of architectural and natural elements, primarily in glass mosaic. And the third is the rank or the emblem system, which is the personalized emblems that distinguish the members of the Mamluk elite. The first two experiments were intense, though very short-lived. They both more or less disappeared from the Mamluk artistic repertoire around the end of the first quarter of the 14th century, or in the middle of the rule of Nasser Muhammad. The rank system, on the other hand, was to last for the entire Mamluk period, albeit in a transformed form. The early Mamluks patronized, employed, and enjoyed figural art, not only in their private residences and their own illustrated books, but also in more public spaces, such as royal palaces, hammams, and citadels, and even in books that they endowed as public waqf to mosques and madrasas. They sponsored figural paintings, reliefs, murals, and metal works with figures and miniature painting, in addition to textiles adorned with images. They even used images on temporary structures or models for celebration in processions and festivals, and in a few instances even as a warning or as a signal for the people to desist from some prohibited public behavior. An example of the first case happened in 1303 for the triumphant entry to Cairo of al-Nasser Muhammad and his army after defeating the Mongols, when 70 model qal'as or citadels with their equipment were built by the emirs along the way from Bab al-Nasr to the citadel of the mountain. An example of the second case, that is the warning or the warning signal, is when Emir Manjak al-Yusufi put images that are called suwar in the sources of executed women in 1351 on the walls of the city to dissuade Cairene women from wearing men's cloaks, fashion at the time probably was going towards women imitating men, and men didn't like it, so they wanted to punish women for that. The most illustrious examples of figural representation, however, are those that adorned royal palaces and royal objects. Two palaces in the citadel of Cairo, the first built by Baybars and the second by al-Ashraf Khalil, used figural representations on their walls. The two palaces have now disappeared, a fate that unfortunately befell all of the Mamluk royal palaces. But the descriptions that we have of them are very clear about their architecture, decoration, and figures. The palace known as al-Qubba al-Zahiriyya, that is the Zahir dome, which was perhaps the most monumental of Baybars' structure, was supported by 12 colored marble columns, was profusely ornamented, and figures of the Sultan and his emirs were represented. The verb used in the sources is suwirat, which could mean painted as well, on its interior walls. Ibn Shaddad says that the scenes represented Baybars and his emirs and retinue in the day of the procession, which is al-Mawkib, a reference perhaps to a cycle of princely scenes. But instead of proceeding to describe these scenes, Ibn Shaddad cites parts of a poem by Abu al-Fityan ibn Hayyus, a 12th century poet from Damascus, which he says almost depicts the representations of the Qubba's wall. It is a very meager source for us to rely on a poetical quotation written in praise of a structure used to describe another structure that belonged to a different time and place. But given the lack of information on figural representations in Mamluk palaces, the poem does furnish a few clues to the composition and the topic represented. I'll read you parts of the poem. And you behold the birds of the air upon its sides, some in flight, other perching, and race horses whose hooves never leave the ground, as though they gallop beneath their riders. Then those who hurl thunderous blows that do no harm, and those who wear yalmak, yalmak is the cloak of the Mongols, that cannot be removed. A group of them have drawn their shining blades, and another has drawn his bow, whose arrow has no target and cannot leave the bow, and his snares are always fatal for the birds. Baybars' Qubba was not the first structure in Egypt to be decorated with figural representation, and certainly not the only one of his construction at the citadel to have them. Ibn Abdul Zahir, who was the official historian of Baybars, tells us that the new house, which is also called the House of Gold or Bayt al-Zahab, also had representations of soldiers. The chronicle recited a poem of his own composition to praise the structure, in which it is apparent that representation in architecture were not foreign to him. He also alludes to a difference between Baybars' choice of representation and those of his predecessors, in which Baybars' qualities as a fighter and a leader of armies are stressed. From the known themes of the Islamic princely cycle, Baybars is said to have preferred scenes of horsemen and warriors to surround him in his qa'ah, unlike the rulers before him who chose to portray themselves among singers and in drinking settings, probably a direct reference to the Fatimid and Tulunid precedents that we know. This stricture was intentional. Baybars was a very austere ruler whose favorite pastimes were in fact not drinking parties but hunting and furusiyya exercises. Can we have the lights off? And the slides, please. The most famous object that illustrates this preference is the so-called Baptistère de Saint-Louis, a strange name for a little piece of Mamluk art, by the way, whose date and patron have been postulated by S.D. Rice to have been 1310 and Amir Salar respectively. Amir Salar was the vicegerent of the Mamluk Sultan al-Nasser Muhammad. But Doris Berens Abu Saif has recently presented a very persuasive argument that pushed the date back to the 1260s and the patron to have been none other than al-Zahir Baybars himself. The figure on the brace basin have been interpreted to be the great emirs of Baybars, represented individually, and in ceremonial formation around a central figure that might have been Baybars himself in various settings, riding, hunting or killing a bear in here, or sitting in an official majlis flanked by 2 pages. The Amir's figures are divided along ethnic lines into the Turks and the Mongols, who form the 2 dominant groups in Baybars's court. They each are represented with what appears to have been the attribute of their ceremonial office at court. One figure with a sword might have been a silahdar, that is, an arm bearer. Another has a bow, which suggests that he might have been the bunduqdar, or the bow carrier. A third with a ceremonial axe here, which is called jumaq, so he was probably the jumaqdar, the axe bearer. All of these are ceremonial offices, by the way, in the court. And the fourth has a napkin denoting the jamadar, the wardrobe master, and so on. We can go through the figures one by one. By the way, these figures are very, very small on the basin. We're talking about 10 centimeter high figures. Other metalwork objects, such as the bowl, this wall at the Louvre also, like the Baptistère, and also made by the same artist, Ibn al-Zayn is the name of an artist, and his nisba, or his attribute, is al-Musalli, from Mosul, had similar themes, though less well integrated than the Baptistère. Ironically, however, Baybars died in 1276 at the Ablaq Palace he had built in the outskirts of Damascus, of complications following a night of drinking qimmiz, which is a fermented mare milk, a treacherous alcoholic beverage favored by both the Turks and the Mongols. His historians tried to play it down a little bit, but he seemed to have been poisoned by what he drank. The second example of the palaces that I'm talking about, the decorated palaces, is the audience hall or Iwan attributed to Qalawun, which Al-Ashraf Khalil, the son of Qalawun, rebuilt or perhaps only renovated in 1293. Khalil's Iwan, Ibn al-Dawadari reports, had representations of his emirs, each with his own emblem or rank above his head. Although this description recalls the similar treatment in Baybars's Qubba, they were different in composition and possibly in meaning. The one sentence that describes Khalil's Iwan is amply clear that the figures were not put together in composed settings. Rather, each figure representing one emir was set alone. Each emir was reportedly identified not only by the likeness of his image, but also by his rank or his emblem, which was inscribed above his head. From the way they were arranged, these images seem to have their models in a convention of figural representation whose only surviving examples are from the 12th century Jazira or Upper Mesopotamia. The Jaziran examples did not depict composite scenes, but rather single standing figures, which differed from each other only in the attributes of their office, in a way similar to the figures that we just saw in the Baptistère de Saint-Louis, or to this outstanding Minai bowl from the 13th century Iran, which is now at the Freer Gallery in Washington, in which every emir is identified by his honorific title and name. You can read them: Baha'u'ddin, Shamsuddin Ilyas in here, and so on. You can actually identify each and every one of these emirs. Two specific architectural examples from Jazira are known to us. The first is the stone niche from the Gukkumet as-Singar, which was dated to around 1240, which I have only these bad images of. And the second is the stone bridge over the river Tigris built by the Artukid ruler of Hassan Kaifa, which is today in Turkey, Qara Arslan, 1148-1167. The bridge is no longer in a shape to be depicted. In both examples, figures are carved in relief In the first one, this one here, raised rectangular stone slabs, and in the second, inside tri-lobed arched panels. Let me explain what I'm talking about in here. You see this image in here. That's an emir carrying a bow, again probably a bunduqdar. This one here is an emir carrying a sword, again probably a silahdar. There are 8 images in these niches, or in these tri-lobed niches in here, interspersed with these decorative elements, and they surround this niche, this open niche, which interpretation is that it's probably where the ruler, who in this case was Badruddin Lu'lu', the Armenian Mamluk who ruled Mosul for 30 years, probably put his throne in there. And it symbolically surrounds him with all the people who hold offices in his court, with having their representations in there. The 2 sets of images at the palace of Baybars and Khalil could be grouped in one category, the courtly figurative motif, the use of which was a royal prerogative. This is evident from the absence of figural representation in princely structures. They exist only in royal structures. The decision on any particular technique or medium may have been a personal choice of the Sultan, or a result of availability or knowledge of extant examples. But the reasons behind the depiction of horsemanship, processions, hunts, and representations of emirs seem to have been identical. The iconography of these images was a reflection and a condition of the political and military context of the Mamluk state at that period. Baybars, Qalawun, and Khalil were nurtured in a Mamluk milieu. They were laying down the rules and establishing the structural hierarchy of the new Mamluk system. They followed a concept of rule that relied on the acquisition of a personal army of Mamluks to maintain supremacy over the other great emirs in the Sultanate, who also had their personal retinue of Mamluks. The 3 sultans had also distinguished themselves in the field of jihad against the Crusades, the Mongols, and the Armenians. The images in their structures visualized, publicized, and emphasized their belief in the cause they were championing, and their pride and confidence in the Mamluk hierarchy they were fostering, in which their emirs played an important role in the structure of the Mamluk state. Let me just have some water. A complementary set of concerns may be read in another technique. This one revived from earlier Mamluk prototypes, the representation of architectural and natural elements in mosaic. Mamluk mosaic architectural representations seem to have alternated in the early Mamluk royal iconography with the figural representation. 2 examples survive, one complete in Damascus and the other in a much dilapidated state at the citadel of Cairo. The first one in Damascus is the mausoleum of al-Zahir Baybars, who, as I said, died in Damascus in 1276. He was buried there in a hastily built square room covered with a dome in a house bought by order of his son and successor Barakah Khan in 1277, although he had prepared a mausoleum for himself in Cairo. This is, by the way, less than 50 meters from the Umayyad Mosque. If you walk this way, you'll be in the Umayyad Mosque, and that's an important point. The Qubba, or the mausoleum, was apparently not completed until 1281, after the death of Barakah Khan in his entombment with his father by order of Qalawun in the same Qubba. The Qubba has a frieze of glass mosaic, recently renovated, that runs around the 4 walls. 3 of the friezes' 4 sides depict architectural representation. The 4th, or western side, that's the western side in here, the 4 corners and the tympanums and soffits of the 6 windows consist of natural and stylized vegetal motifs coming out of vases, trees, cornucopias, and leafy scrolls reminiscent of the more sophisticated Umayyad examples from the Umayyad Mosque not so far away. The 3 architectural ensembles depicted in the mausoleum of Baybars are symmetrically arranged around the centers of their walls. The most elaborate scene is set on the south wall, with the mimbar in here, and these are, by the way, the tombs of Baybars and Barakah Khan. Its central field is occupied by two superimposed compositions, which you have in detail in here. The lower one consists of a 4-column arcade followed by 5 freestanding columns crowned with natural leaves instead of the usual Corinthian capitals. The upper group consists of 2 identical long structures flanking a central tower with a spire. The 2 buildings seem to be depicted in perspective as their side walls run at the angle with the middle tower. Both buildings are topped by what looks like central domes over high drums, with pointed profiles rising behind the gabled roofs. The space between the 2 buildings and the central tower is occupied by wavy lines, these lines in here, of white and dark blue tessera, possibly suggesting water, and probably borrowed from the famous Barada scene in the Umayyad mosque. The eastern wall has 2 groups of structures as well. The frontal 3-column arcade is stocky and short. Its light brown arches are covered with curving vegetal motifs as if they were trellises carrying plants. You can see those here. Their spans are closed with curtains tied near their lower end and wavering in the wind, in a manner reminiscent of the curtains of the representation of the Palace of Theodoric in Santa Apollinaire Nuevo at Ravenna, which was done in 490, or even closer to the few representations of curtains at the Umayyad Mosque, of which 2, at least, if not more, are attributed to the renovations ordered by Baybars himself. And you can see the curtains that I'm talking about. You can see that the renovation, probably because these tessera fell off, came and sort of like imposed this structure, which is not very different from the structures that we see in the dome, in the tomb of Baybars, on what was probably initially just a tree. And what's missing here is the trunk of the tree, and you can see the difference in color between the 13th century tessera and the 7th or 8th century tessera in here. The rear group, let's go back here. No, back. Oh, here it is, yes, I'm sorry. The rear group is symmetrically organized around a central spire tower. The 2 side corners of the composition are occupied by 2 domed towers frontally represented and divided as if to make 2-storied structures. The architectural scene is flanked by 2 huge balls with simplistic arrangement reminiscent of the Dome of the Rock's vases, but rougher in execution. The 2 ends of the field above the curves of the window arches are taken up with 2 more architectural groups, which are mirror reflections of one another. Each is made of 2 long gabled structures and a dome tower behind the front tower, each one of those here. The third architectural scene appears on the northern wall above the entrance. Oh, I'm sorry, we should go further. Thank you. Its center is taken up by a huge tree whose branches and foliage are executed in the same method of gradual shading found in Umayyad representations of trees. 2 identical groups of buildings, both oriented toward the east so as not to give the impression of being reflections of one another. You can see them here. Flank the tree. Both groups are displayed atop what appears to be a crude rendition of a green hill lush with plants and trees. A huge domed tower occupies the center, surrounded by 2 long gabled buildings, behind each of which stands another tower similar to the central one but smaller. A strange, flat and slanted element appears midway. I'm talking about this element here, or you can see it in detail here. Appears midway along the height of the central tower. If this does not represent some unknown convention of roof, it might be depicting the slanted roof of a wind catcher, which is called in the sources of the period Badahanj, and which is called here in Kuwait Badgir, which was a familiar element in a Mamluk city skyline. These architectural representations were seen as either an aberration or a single attempt to adopt the old Umayyad scenes outside of their own context. But in 1985, a Mamluk Qa'a was discovered at the citadel of Cairo, that's the Qa'a, with fragments of mosaic displaying architectural representation. This new find clearly demonstrates that the Qubba al-Zahiriyya scene were not an isolated experiment and provides new clues to the uses and range of themes of mosaic decoration under the Mamluks. Unfortunately, 2 fragments are all that remains from the large mosaic frieze which once ran around the inner walls of the excavated Qa'a. The first is so effaced, and this is a 1985 picture, so 1997 it's probably no longer there, that no description of its composition is possible, although it undoubtedly shows a structure on its left corner. You can probably make it up in here. There's a structure standing there. The second displays a building flanked by trees. You can see the building here and the 2 trees on the side. The workmanship is different from that of the Qubba al-Zahiriyya in Damascus, and the size of the tessera is much larger, but the representation is nonetheless expressive. The structure in the middle appears to be a light, tripartite, and domed garden pavilion with wide openings. You can make the openings here. 1, 2, 3, 4 openings. Its first level consists of an arcaded porch. The center of the second level is occupied by a 2-storied structure surmounted by a pear-shaped lantern. You can see the lantern in here and the 2 stories in the middle here, whose base is embellished by round tessera of mother of pearl. It is flanked by 2 light structures whose tops are unfortunately deleted, but they must have been domed lanterns as well, because the ubiquitous pointed representations of drums, and I'm talking about these here, and the drums are here, suggestive of a dome on top, are still intact. Trees with unnatural large leaves appear from behind these 2 structures, as if to suggest a sense of depth in what is otherwise a totally flat architectural representation. Like the scenes of the Qubba al-Zahiriyya, the architectural scenes in the Qa'a, which I actually attributed to Al-Ashraf Khalil, seems to have been related to contemporary Mamluk architecture. It recalls in its general character the type of structures named manzara, which was a light pavilion in a pleasance garden with numerous openings. The etymology of the word manzara alludes to the structure's basic function as the place whence one looks out, perhaps the equivalent of a belvedere. But unfortunately, we do not have any contemporary description of the actual layout and form of a real manzara. But what was the meaning or meanings which were read into the mosaic architectural representations in general, and which went above and beyond their architectural iconography, which I analyzed? The meaning was, I believe, pride in the territorial conquests of the early Mamluk sultans and the extent of their dominion. Baybars, Qalawun, and al-Ashraf Khalil had distinguished themselves in fighting the Crusades and the Mongols, and had managed to recover the whole of natural Syria from them and secure it for the Mamluk Sultanate. They naturally would have wanted to celebrate these conquests, and through them to assert their sovereignty and to exalt their own persons in clear and lasting ways. Thus, probably, the idea of reading into the stylized architectural representations on the wall messages about the geographic extent of the Sultan's dominion, and that's probably how it was developed. This interpretation is very hard to substantiate in the written sources. The available texts do not even report the existence of the scenes in the Damascene mausoleum or the Cairene Qa'a in the first place. But a single reference furnishes an explicit indication of the type of messages assigned to the architectural representations in a contemporary palatial structure. Ibn Abd al-Zahir, who again was the semi-official court historian for both Baybars and Qalawun, relates in the event of the year 1284 that when Qalawun built a new throne hall called Qubba as well, every throne hall is called Qubba in that period, in the court of the citadel, he ordered depicted on the walls of its riwaqs the likeness, that is sifat, of each of his castles, husun, plural of husan, and citadels, qila, plural of qal'a, surrounded by mountains, valleys, rivers, and seas. Clearly, what Ibn Abd al-Zahir is expressing in this sentence is the official reading of the scenes. The very similitude as we understand it today between the architectural representations and Qalawun's actual castles was of no importance. If at all, to the plausibility of their identification as the castles themselves. What counted was that these scenes provided probable and variegated images that could be read as representing the real castles and forests and fortresses. Slight differences in compositions, similar to the ones encountered between the scenes in Al-Qubba al-Zahiriyya, would have been sufficient to justify their interpretation as different localities by contemporary viewers. The patron needs only supply the intended messages in a pictorial vehicle that broadly corresponds to them to be accepted by his audience. At the citadel, Qalawun's major objective was most probably to exploit these identifications to boast of his own military achievements and the extent of his dominion in a single prominent space, that is, his own throne hall. My last example of a visual innovation of the Mamluks is the rank system. Rank, a Persian word which literally means color, hue, or dye, was used in medieval Arabic sources primarily to designate the insignia of Mamluk emirs and sultans. From Baybars's time until the end of the Mamluk period, ranks were adopted by sultans, emirs, and perhaps other high officials. They were carved on buildings, painted on glass, woods, and pottery, engraved on metalwork, struck on coins, and embroidered or dyed on textiles. Mamluk ranks first appeared as single-element emblems. Horizontal stripes were introduced to the shields in the early 14th century, and in the 15th and early 16th century, ranks developed into composite shields with 3 fields, each containing 1 sign or more. Most emirial ranks were denotative, displaying the codified images they had created to represent the attributes of their offices, positions, and ideals. The rank of Qawsun, for example, who died in 1342, and who was the favorite cup-bearer or saqi of al-Nasser Muhammad, carries a cup, as in this lamp and stone relief from his mosque built in 1336, which today has disappeared, and we have only the entrance to the mosque. Although if you go to Cairo, you still would find a mosque called Masjid Qaysoon, but it's all totally rebuilt. But this is at the museum, at the Islamic Art Museum in Cairo, and this is the rank of Qawsun, with his cup, and the two stretches here of the shields are in red and blue. And this one is probably lacking the last one because this is from the same building, and obviously since they're using marble, they didn't color it, but this would have been probably red. The rank of a silahdar, the arm bearer, was a sword. You can see the rank of a silahdar on this water canteen from the Museum of Damascus in this case. And that of the bundukdar, and this one here is a lamp from the khanqa of Aydukin al-Bundukdari, who was the master and owner of al-Zahir Baybars, and that's why al-Zahir Baybars carried the title al-Bundukdari in reverence to his master. And this one has 2 stylized bow because he was the bundukdar of the sultan. Other ranks combine more than 1 sign of office, such as the rank of Nawruz al-Hafizi. This is the development that I'm talking about in the 15th and 16th century, inscribed on the walls of his madrasa in Damascus, which has 2 cups and 1 inkwell. This is a stylized form of an inkwell, denoting the dawadar, or the inkwell carrier, or the inkwell bearer. or the rank of Khair Bek in Aleppo. This is the entrance to the caravanserai of Khair Bek in Aleppo, which was built in 1509, and which has, again, 2 cups in here, 1 little napkin or lozenge here. Also, this means a jamadar. And these 2 here, these 2 forms, have not been explained. There are so many theories about their meaning. Some people think that they are the powder socks, where they carried powder when they introduced firearms for the first time, but we are not clear of their direct meaning. What's important about them is that they no longer denote the office. These 2 people were never saqis. So what we see here is a composite image that has all sorts of attributes that do not tell us who these people or what these people occupied that court, but they tell us under who they served. So this guy here served under Qansu al-Ghuri, the last Mamluk Sultan, and all the emir of Qansu al-Ghuri carried ranks that had a napkin, 2 cups, but these forms varied on the side, and that's how you distinguish between one and the other. This here, Nawruz al-Hafizi, served lately under Qaitbay, al-Ashraf Qaitbay. So we have here the rank that distinguishes all the emirs of al-Ashraf Qaitbay. The most exceptional and rarest ranks may be termed representative. They depict images of animals and mythical creatures and may have been seen as bestowing the qualities of the represented animal on the bearer of the rank. They too appear to have been dropped from the Mamluk expressive repertoire by the middle of the 14th century. Perhaps the most famous of these figures was the lion, or feline in general, symbols of power, protection, and invincibility, and the double-headed eagle, a mysterious figure which may have symbolized the ruler or defender of 2 countries. Some of you are familiar with the double-headed eagle of the German Republic today, which probably was inherited from the Turks, something that the Germans have to give due to the Turks for. Both motifs appear in early Mamluk ranks, and both seem to have been adopted from earlier, less stylized uses of the same figures. The bicephalic eagle, for example, appears together with 2 lions on the Yedi Kardash, or the 7-brother gate in Diyarbakir in Turkey today, the stylized double-headed eagle in here, and the 2 lions, and the title of al-Malik al-Salih in here. Mahmud ibn Muhammad the Artukid, who built the gate in 1208-1209. And alone on the western portal of the Ulu Jami in Divri in Turkey, also today in central Turkey, constructed in 1228-1229 by the Manjukikid Emir Ahmad Shah. Another example surviving in the citadel of Cairo, which is still an enigma as far as date and provenance. No single Egyptian historian reports this eagle, has lost its double-headed head. But we have the report of Evliya Çelebi, who wrote in the early 17th century and who said that it had a double head at the time. Emirs too use the same bicephalic eagle motif we find in architecture on their metal bowls, such as this, and on their metal bowls, on their boxes and incense burners. And what we see here is an incense burner, a very beautiful pierced globe made around 1270 for the Emir Badruddin Baysarai al-Shamsi, one of Baybars's great Emir, which is today at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, whose rank might have been double-headed eagle, although we don't know, that appears 4 times on the sphere. You can see them 1, 2, 3, and the 4th is on the other side. The lion or feline motif appears in countless examples covering the entire Middle East, from Azerbaijan to Egypt. An interesting example is at the citadel of Aleppo. And here, I hope you forgive me for the quality of this slide, but it was so dark in this passage coming into the citadel of Aleppo. But these here are very interesting 2 examples, because they are dubbed the smiling and crying lions in Arabic, al-Dahik wal-Baki, because of their facial expressions. And I don't know if you can notice, but this guy here is crying, this guy here is laughing or smiling. and they flank an inner door of the citadel, and they are attributed to al-Zahir Ghazi, the Ayyubid. Other examples can be found in many Seljukid Khans and madrasas, such as the figure protruding from the walls of the Sultan Khan near Kaisarai, built by Ala ad-Din Kaikubad I between 1232-1236, and in Cairo, where we find it as the door knocker to the entrance to the Bimaristan of Al-Mansur Qalawun in central street of Old Cairo, completed in 1284. Baybars's rank is a feline rather than a lion passant. It adorned all his buildings, such as the Burj al-Siba, or the Tower of Lions, at the citadel of Cairo, discovered also in 1285. And if you make it to Cairo today, you'll see them also falling apart. This figural rank, which was never to be adopted again by other Mamluk sultans, may have implied power and courage, and may have also illustrated Baybars's own name, Baybars, meaning chief panther in Kipchak Turkish. But despite its stylized contours and pure emblematic function, Baybars's rank did not go down well with all elements of his society. Maqrizi, for instance, records that a certain Sufi sheikh by the name of Muhammad Saim al-Dahr, the eternally fasting, tried in 1379 to break both the feline ranks of Baybars inscribed on the Qanatir al-Siba in Cairo and the face of the Sphinx, claiming it to be his moral obligation. By the way, this proves that it was not the Fatimids that destroyed the face of the Sphinx. If by the 14th century it was still complete for Saim al-Dahr to try to complete it, I still tend to believe that Napoleon is the one that did it. Very little is known about the significance of ranks in Mamluk society. Like European nobility, sultans and emirs seem to have used their ranks both as decipherable codes and as signatures displayed on their buildings and objects, or on those they wanted to claim as their own. But unlike coats of arms in Europe, ranks do not seem to have carried any heraldic potential. This apparent absence of a hereditary mechanism may have been the major reason why the institution of rank died out after the fall of the Mamluks and the coming of the Ottomans in 1517. The practice of decorating palace walls with figural or architectural representations, or using figures for ranks, was abandoned by the time of al-Nasser Muhammad and was replaced by decorative, emblematic, and iconographic inscriptions. My final question is, why did this happen? Here too, I have a tentative explanation, which rests more on historical observations than on detailed and unequivocal evidence. Al-Nasser Muhammad's third reign, which lasted from 1310 to 1341, proved to be a turning point in Mamluk history. Actually, a recent book uses that, a turning point in Mamluk history, the third reign of al-Nasser Muhammad, and in the character of the Mamluk state. After nearly 70 years of almost continuous warfare, the Mamluk state managed to eliminate the immediate external and internal dangers threatening its hold on all of Egypt and Syria. The Crusaders were routed, and the Ilkhanid Mongol menace had been repeatedly thwarted. The Mamluk state had finally achieved political maturity and regional supremacy. The ensuing stabilization of the Mamluk rule and its acceptance by most subject groups led to the relaxation of the Mamluk caste's insular lifestyle during the long, relatively stable, and highly autocratic rule of al-Nasser Muhammad. The shift to epigraphic surface articulation and the elimination of figural representations, along with the disappearance of many other artistic and architectural trends of that period, such as, for example, the building of palaces of justice, Dar al-Adl, could be viewed as symptoms of the changes brought about by the expiration of the counter-crusade and subsequent shift in the image of the Mamluk ruling elite. The Mamluk culture, which had remained overtly foreign in inspiration and outlook at least until the middle of the 14th century, began, after decades of nearly separate existence, slowly to adopt some of the characteristics of the indigenous urban culture, while at the same time some of the Mamluks' more peculiar customs seeped into the local milieu. The acculturation continued after al-Nasser Muhammad and seems to have accelerated with the relaxing of the strict program that governed the Mamluks' training during the formative period. After the tumultuous transition from the Qalawuni to the Circassian period at the end of the 14th century, new Mamluks began to be brought at a fairly advanced age, after their character had already been formed and were no longer required to undergo an extensive religious education before their manumission. They were also permitted to fraternize with the locals through marriage and business transaction, a practice that was totally forbidden them throughout the 13th and early 14th century. By the beginning of the 15th century, the Mamluks' acculturation was discernible not only in their attitudes, tastes, and preferences, but most of all in the little interest they showed in emphasizing their jihad role, their Mamluk solidarity, or their pro-religion stances in their political image making. Thank you.